All right, guys, we are back in my garage for another video. And as you all know, everybody loves to hate the BMW M3s when the new ones are first announced. Oh, you don't know that? Well, that's strange. It seems like this is a cycle that we go through over and over, but almost monthly at this point, I'm having a conversation with somebody that says the G80 is the only M3 that people have ever hated. So I decided to make this video to remind people why previous generations of the M3 gave people a big cause for concern, and a lot of folks that were OG owners weren't really interested in buying the new one. So let's go ahead and start with the E92 M3. Yes, the beloved E92 is one of the ones that I remember people were not fans of. And the big reason was the V8 engine. Again, yes, the glorified S65 that is everybody's just favorite thing in the world now was something that people were worried about in the past. And the common sentiment at the time was basically that an M3 should come with an inline engine. I specifically remember people saying an M3 should have an inline 6. And it's funny because if you consider the E30, that car had an inline 4, but I guess we just pushed that out of our memory, and everybody was expecting the E90 and E92 just to have the next evolution of the S52 and S54, maybe a slightly bigger, slightly beefier inline 6 engine. So there were a lot of concerns about the V8. And at the time, you have to remember the competitors being Audi and Mercedes both had V8s in the direct competitors with the BMW M3. So Audi had the 4.2 liter engine in their RS4 and RS5 models. And then, of course, Mercedes with their C63 AMG had a huge V8 in their cars as well. And so what a lot of people's perception was is that BMW was trying to compete with them by putting a V8 engine in the M3 as well, and that would completely ruin the driving experience, because if you look at a Mercedes, it was kind of known as a burnout machine, and if you looked at an Audi, it was known for having really bad understeer. So with this huge heavy V8 at the front, it was just going to ruin the driving characteristics that we became familiar with and fell in love with when we think about a BMW M3. We want something that's light, something that's sharp, that turns in really well, and can get us around a track with some precision. But the funny thing is, despite all of those concerns, if you actually look at the weight, the S65 is actually lighter than the S54. They actually saved 30 pounds by going from the inline 6 to the V8. The main reason being that the S54 had an iron block while the S65 had an aluminum block. So even though you added 0.8 liters of displacement and 2 additional cylinders, you're able to get an engine that's almost 30 pounds lighter. So that was something that eventually we found out wasn't as big of a concern as people thought, but still to this day you hear people say the E90 has the huge heavy V8 up front. It's just kind of a common sentiment that everybody stuck with. But despite the slight weight savings we got on the engine, the overall car was much heavier, and this was a big cause for concern. The car was getting too big, it was getting too heavy, it no longer felt like an M3. And a lot of that, I believe, was motivation for BMW to come out with, you know, the E82 1 Series and then eventually the 1M and M2 to kind of fill the gap for people that still wanted that small, more compact sports car. But the E90 and E92 continued to grow, so it was almost 200 pounds heavier than a comparable E46 M3. If you looked at, you know, two cars that were coupes and manual transmission and everything pretty much the same, it's almost like a 180 pound penalty by going to the newer car. And it was much bigger, so when you were driving it, you felt hopefully a little more stable because it increased the track width and all of that. But with the longer wheelbase, it just took up a lot more space and didn't have the car feeling kind of wrapped around you like the older E46 did. So something that a lot of people were concerned about when they were considering going to the newer car. And then you might think, well, if it weighs a lot more, maybe they gave it a lot more power. And that was probably the nail in the coffin. One of the biggest things that people were concerned with was that the 4-liter just was very underwhelming in its performance figures. It did make over 400 horsepower, but it made less power than the comparable RS4. It made less power than the comparable C63. And it made less than 300 foot-pounds of torque, which still to this day, I don't understand why that is. I guess a lot of people say it's due to the displacement and, you know, setting it up to be high revving instead of really punchy down low, but it was a pretty big disappointment. And then on top of that, not just comparing it to the competition, but even to its own little brother. If you look at the 335i that came with the N54 engine, it had more torque than the E92 M3. So you basically had a lower tier model in the 3 Series lineup, making more torque and feeling punchier because it had that wider torque band due to the twin turbos. So a lot of people basically commented that the 335 felt better around town and regular driving, and you really had to wind out the E92 in order to feel the extra performance up top. And that just wasn't something that motivated everybody. So it was nice on track, did what we needed it to do, came with a lot of penalties, but overall just wasn't as exciting of a drop as a lot of people were hoping for. Now, of course, there were some things that people liked. A big one was the dual clutch transmission. That was a huge upgrade compared to the SMG that was the automatic option for the E46 M3. So that was something that people fell in love with. And also with the S65, people knew right out of the box that it was going to rev high and it was going to sound good. A high revving V8 pretty much always sounds great. And every single review that I saw at the time highlighted that as basically the main thing. Even if it's not as fast as the competition, even if it's not as punchy as its younger siblings, it still is extremely thrilling to drive from the driver's seat, especially with the windows down, because all of the sensations that it gives you just makes it a lot of fun to drive. So that was basically where a lot of people landed. It's not the fastest out of the bunch, but it is the one that they enjoyed the most. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I remember this very vividly because this was around the time that I was getting my driver's license, starting to pay attention more to cars. I started getting, Road and Track magazines, Motor Trend magazines, watching review videos and stuff. And I remember how this went. When you looked at the forums, people were not happy. As always, eventually people grew into it. And then the next one came out, and that's really when I feel like people fell in love with the E92. Because why? They hated the F80. I know people can't believe it now, but the F80 was not something that everybody was a fan of, again, for a couple different reasons. The big thing that I remember is, like usual, the engine. When they switched from the V8 back to the Inline-6, people celebrated. Then they found out the Inline-6 had turbos and they became frustrated again because just like before, there was this common sentiment that an M3 had to be naturally aspirated. It had always been naturally aspirated and turbos were going to cause it to overheat. It was going to be harder to drive. It was, again, just going to be a burnout machine like the C63 and making all this torque that makes it difficult to get around track quickly. And I mean, I understand it, especially because the E92 had its own issues with, rod bearings and stuff, and people weren't interested in a new M3 that was going to have brand new issues by adding turbos and an air-to-water intercooler and all these new technologies that they slapped on the F80. Thankfully, it ended up proving out to be pretty solid, but that initial take, when people saw that, they were not thrilled. Another thing that I remember very specifically is people hated how the headlights touched the grille. And it's kind of like now how we see the memes about the grills on BMWs getting bigger and bigger and bigger. I remember people talking about the headlights getting closer and closer until they finally actually touched the grills. And people didn't like that across the F-Series range. That was for any F30, F32, and then of course that translated to the F80 and F82. So just the design language that came with those new headlights were not something that people appreciated. And then I think from a more cultural standpoint, a lot of people were arguing about the new M4. They did not like that there was never going to be a coupe or two-door M3 again because BMW introduced the new M4 nomenclature. And I still to this day don't fully understand the strategy there. I mean, I guess they did that for the entire lineup. Basically, all of the numbers have some kind of unique feature to the vehicle, and they wanted the 4 Series and the coupes to kind of have their own dedicated design language compared to the regular 3 Series and the sedans. But it was just interesting that they wanted it to have a unique name that specifically, because they'd had 2 and 4-door M3s and 2 and 4-door 3 Series in the past. But now making sure that it's not just a 2-door M3, but a 3 and a 4 Series separately was kind of weird. And then, of course, they came out with the 4-door version of the 2-door version of the 4-door car when they made the 4 Series Grand Coupe. It just didn't really make any sense. But all of that created a definite divide in the people that wanted to say, it's never going to be an M4. I'm going to rebadge it to an M3 and all of that good stuff. So yeah, a lot of people got up in arms about that. But again, as usual, there were things to like. And I remember the biggest thing that people were fans of is, as far as I can remember, this was the first and probably only M3 where a new generation came in lighter than the predecessor. So they were able to save, I think, 30 pounds when they went to the F80 platform from the E92. So now you were able to move to a new car that was, yes, still bigger, still wider, still longer, but it actually weighed less than the E92. A lot of this was due to using more lightweight materials. They added the lightweight battery in the trunk. It also came with the carbon ceramic brake option. So there were a lot of things about it that allowed it to be lighter than the predecessor while still making more power and more torque to help improve the overall performance figures. Now, speaking of brakes, this was also the first M3 that came with proper Brembos from the factory, and that was really exciting. On the older E92, people always had to update to Brembo or AP Racing or something for dedicated track use because nobody wanted the sliding calipers on their track car. So it was awesome to see that these cars came with a proper track capable brake setup directly from the factory. The only thing you might need to do is swap some brake pads and it was good to go. So that was very exciting to see. And then of course, with the new carbon ceramic option, you had even more performance with less brake dust and much bigger rotors. So all around, it was a welcome upgrade. And then of course, even though people hated the idea of the M3 having a turbo engine, they were excited about the opportunity to take advantage of those turbos. It finally came with some proper torque, and they anticipated that it was going to be a lot more tunable because instead of comparing the M3 to, the more tunable N54, now you actually had the twin turbo power plant in the M car. So they were anticipating it was going to be able to make the same amount of gains by just a flash, and hopefully that would be able to be handled fine on track. So that's when people really started tinkering with the cars, and while the E92 maybe didn't give as much motivation to tune it and mess with the engine, when the F80 came out, that was kind of the default answer to get at least a stage 1 flash and get the car making what it should be making from the factory. But all of that is peanuts compared to the reception we saw when the G80 was announced. And this one is near and dear to my heart, specifically because I leased my 440i when I heard that the new M3 and M4 were going to be coming out. So I figured, I'll hold on to it for 3 years. And if the G80 looks great, I'll turn in my lease and jump into the new M3. And as you can see, I've still got the 440. So that is something to this day. I am not a fan of the looks. That was, of course, as you all know by now, the biggest complaint. It has the huge grills up front and is just an overall design language that is, how should I say it? Very polarizing. Definitely something that stands out. I think over time it has grown on a lot of people, but I'm not one of them, and I would argue that for most people, it's just not really the case. There are a lot of different things that you can do now, like swapping the grills, or some people are making aftermarket bumpers to quote unquote fix the front end, but I think in general, it's just not really a good looking car. I would definitely put the M340 front above any G80 front, but because they separated the 3 and 4 series, they always put the 4 series front end on the M3 and M4. Same thing they did with the F80 and F82, they're doing on the G80 and G82. So it is what it is. Those cars are going to look how they look, but that's something that for sure, before people heard anything else about the car, just seeing it made people want to go somewhere else. And then along with that, the car gained some weight, and it actually gained a lot of weight. With certain options, you can see the car at over 500 pounds heavier than the outgoing F80 and F82, which is insane. I don't think I've seen that big of a weight jump on a car that didn't get a hybrid battery or some, crazy new technology or feature built into the car. It's literally just heavier. I don't know where the weight is. I mean, it is a much bigger car than the F80 and F82, but in general, it's just kind of crazy to think how much more weight that car has compared to a pretty similarly spec'd F80 or F82 that came before it. Even, going on a side note, not talking about the M3, but the M2, it only saves like 30 pounds compared to the M3 and M4. I still just do not understand why those cars weigh so much. But back to the M3. So that car gave us a huge weight penalty, and along with that, it came with all-wheel drive. Now, this was similar to the M5's reception. When the M5 first got all-wheel drive, people weren't fans of it, but BMW reassured us that we would be able to turn it off. The only difference here is you were still able to get it in rear-wheel drive if you wanted, and you were still able to get it with a manual transmission. So when the M5 came out, They said all-wheel drive is what you get, turn it off if you don't want to use it. With the G80, you were able to option it with all-wheel drive, but you didn't have to. But the all-wheel drive was the same MX drive that you could enable and disable as you wished. Now, surprise, the X drives are the most sought after now. They are the most sold now. They're the most expensive ones. All of that kind of came together to prove BMW's theory that with this level of horsepower and torque, you need all-wheel drive to take full advantage of it. So everybody that was frustrated with the all-wheel drive in the past ended up being in the minority of actual owners that were buying the cars because the X drives are selling like crazy. And on top of that, I think paired with the all-wheel drive, people eventually came around to just take the car for the headroom. Regardless of how you feel about the looks, you can't deny the power plant and its capability. The car is making over 700 wheel horsepower on stock turbos with just a tune and a little bit of hardware. And it's crazy to think that you can get that much performance out of a 4,000-pound sedan. But these cars are fast, they have a lot of headroom, they're able to be pushed even further with upgraded turbos and fuel systems. And at this point, they've relatively been figured out. You know, it's more or less a cookie cutter solution to get the car to do whatever you want it to do. So that's where everybody landed. I feel like, again, most people still don't like how they look, but people are ignoring that due to the performance opportunity on the table. So yeah, that's what I remember growing up with M3s coming out over the past 20 years or so. Again, this is just kind of my take or my memory from when I was really paying attention to things. I didn't see when the E46 came out or the E36 came out. In my opinion, the E46 is still the best looking and probably best M3 from a OG BMW philosophy standpoint. I've never owned one, I've never driven one, but I think that's the one that I would like to own the most at some point in my life. Still disappointing that the cars are pretty underpowered, especially in this day and age, but I think it would be an amazing car to drive and build. So hopefully one day I will own one of those. But let me know, what's your favorite BMW? Which one would you like to own? And what's your favorite BMW to hate? And why is it the G80? I'm curious to hear your thoughts. So let me know what you think, but otherwise that's it for this video. So thank you guys for watching, and I hope this helps. And if you have any other questions or comments, leave them down below.